Lecture. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you to this broadcast presented by the Asian Theological Institute at the United Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia. My name is Paul Rajashekar, Director of the Asian Theological Institute, Professor of Systematic Theology Emeritus, and former Dean of ULS. For those of you who do not know about ATI, ATI is a mentoring program for doctoral students of Asian heritage established in 2007. It has fostered a global network of Asian scholars in Christian theology and studies. The annual Mentoring Institute is held on the campus of United Lutheran Seminary and is assisted by a distinguished group of Asian and Asian American scholars. You may find more details of ATI at uls.edu/ATI or simply put Asian Theological Institute on your search engine. With this year's cohort, ATI celebrates a milestone of almost 350 doctoral candidates mentored by this program. ATI is now expanding its programmatic outreach and will hold its first mentoring seminar for doctoral candidates studying and residing in Asia in October 2025. Today's ATI Lecture is delivered live before an audience of ATI faculty and doctoral candidates from across the United States, Canada, and Australia on the campus of ULS. I am pleased to introduce to you my friend, colleague, and former student, Dr. Jayakiran Sebastian, H. George Anderson Professor of Mission and Cultures, former academic dean of ULS. His full credentials and accomplishments are found in the flyer shared with you. Briefly, he is a graduate of United Theological College, Bengaluru, India, also my alma mater, and he holds a doctoral degree from the University of Hamburg in Germany. He has been on the faculty of ULS since 2007 and is a faculty member of ATI since then. He is an outstanding scholar in early Christianity, ecumenism, missions, Indian Christianity, and everything else under the sun. Dr. Sebastian will speak to us about why should Asian theologians wrestle with the Council of Nicaea on this anniversary. If time permits, we will entertain some questions following the lecture. You can come forward before the microphone. So please welcome Dr. Jayakiran Sebastian.
Thank you very much, my dear teacher, mentor, colleague, and friend, Dr. Paul Rajashekar. One thing to clarify before I begin, having been formed in the German academic tradition, my preferred way of teaching is speaking for 3 hours non-stop. So when you asked, is it going to be 40 minutes, we have to wait and see. I begin with a quotation from Philip Jenkins' new book, Kingdoms of This World, How Empires Have Made and Remade Religions. Consciously or not, churches channeled dead empires. The events and legacy of what happened 1,700 years ago in Nicaea continue to impact the life and witness of churches all over the world in theological, ecclesial, hermeneutical, sociological, and ecumenical terms even today. And it is incumbent on us, Asian Americans, those working in the Asian context, those working in the diaspora, to engage in an honest and courageous discussion and interrogation of those events. I'm keenly aware of the reality that Asia itself is a construct and represents the power of the formulaic in a mythic geography, as Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, writing in a different context, strikingly reminds us, a mythic geography. A new book investigates the material remains of the purported place where the council was held and examines the material remains of what the writer asserts is the birthplace of Christian theology. While this seems to be an exaggeration, since one can make the case that Christian theology was born 3 centuries before Nicaea, there is something to ponder upon here in terms of what I call attempts to formalize Christian teaching and Christian theology seen in Trinitarian terms, recognizing, of course, that the doctrine of the Holy Spirit was left open at that time to be filled in during those years of tumultuous ferment leading up to the Council of Constantinople in 381. At the same time, one has to reckon with what is seen as the fall of the church, given the nexus between empire and the church at the Council of Nicaea and beyond. Daniel H. Williams writes, the 4th century saw that moment in ecclesiastical history when the context and community of Christian faith was radically changed once a Roman emperor adopted its beliefs and lived long enough to enforce politically its way of expressing those beliefs. It is also an obligation on our part to consider and respond to the query as to whether in receiving Nicaea, we ought to consider if we also have received and implicitly accepted the narrative of the winners, as young Richard Kim writes in his introduction to the Cambridge Companion to the Council of Nicaea. I have spent a lot of time and energy in my own work on the early teachers of faith, including in my published doctoral dissertation on the baptismal controversy in Cyprian of Carthage, developing the principle of reaching back in order to move forward, and also on ways of enlivening the past, which forms the title of my other book, which is entitled An Asian Theologian's Engagement with the Early Teachers of Faith. I concluded that book with these words: reaching back in order to move forward would imply that one needs to problematize the present, and in doing so, one needs to understand and represent the past in order to shape the future. Understand and represent the past in order to shape the future. All this leads us to ask about the role of the past in the present, including in terms of our desire for unity, unity in mission, unity in witness, to ask about the construction of the past in the present, including the reality of past theological controversies and debates in the life of Asian Christians and indeed in Asia itself. The Bulgarian winner of the International Booker Prize 2023 for his novel Time Shelter, Georgy Gospodinov, in looking at the past wrote, "Does the past disintegrate, or does it remain practically unchanged like plastic bags, slowly and deeply poisoning everything around itself? Shouldn't there be factories for recycling the past somewhere? Can you make anything else of the past except past? Could it be recycled in reverse into some kind of future, albeit second-hand? Now, he says, these are some questions for you." Among the questions that we Asian theologians need to ask is the question about whether Nicaea should in any way determine our own theological quest, a rather odd question to ask, one may say, since we are gathered here to talk about why should Asian theologians wrestle with the Council of Nicaea. How do we respond to the point made by a formidable patristic scholar of a previous generation, Robert Grant, who wrote about the need to free ourselves from the notion, to free ourselves from the belief that either Nicaea or Chalcedon was predestined? Not all churches found in Asia have bound their theology inextricably to Nicaea, and the reality is that churches there diverge on post-Nicene developments, including the events leading up to and beyond the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and the emergence of the filioque clause in Western Latin theology that have intensely engaged ecumenical conversations at multiple levels, including most recently in the Common Statement on the Filioque, coming from the Joint International Commission on Theological Dialogue between the Lutheran World Federation and the Orthodox Church on May 27, 2024. As we look back at an event that continues to reverberate directly and indirectly and impacts our identity as Asian Christians today in so many different ways, sometimes clearly seen and sometimes more opaquely, we now need to focus on how we, Asian Christians, wrestle with the Council of Nicaea. And I want to offer a certain number of ways of dealing with this. One, Nicaea and the history of the church in Asia. As anyone who has taught or studied Asian Christian theology and the history of the church in Asia can attest, getting a handle on what Asia is a Herculean task and almost impossible to get a clear answer, even in geographical terms. Some ecumenical international church organizations have bundled up things in talking about Asia Pacific. But does this help or complexify matters further? What about Asia Atlantic? What about the Asianness of Asia? Something that Spivak admits that she has trained to imagine, pointing out that it is not a place, yet the name is laden with history and cultural politics. Is there a way of encapsulating that in terms of food, clothes, climate, shared histories, or ethnicity? An attempt to answer this question reveals the absurdity of essentializing Asianness. And yet, here we are, celebrating our diversity, and at the same time seeing in the faces of one another, not strangers, but fellow sojourners and fellow explorers of the Nicene legacy, whether we come from the Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, or Pentecostal traditions, or others that are a hybrid of these broad categories, or even fall outside these oversimplified umbrella terms that often do not do justice to the involvedness of our faith identities within the Christian fold, not to say anything about the reality that many of us personally embody manifold religious belongings and assorted denominational belongings in who we are and from where we come and from where we are at present. As Asian Christians who, for the most part, affirm our baptismal identity as a primary step in our Christian belonging to Christ and Christ's church, Nicaea offers us much to think about, given that the Roman Emperor Constantine was now playing the role of imperial patron of the church. And in the decade leading up to the Council of Nicaea, it was his intent to end all arguing about the godness of Christ and the wrangling between Arius and those who opposed some of his views, which didn't help the imperial desire for theological uniformity and clarity. What all this led to at the council was voting about God by a large group of Eastern bishops with hardly anyone from the Latin West. Canon 19 of the council has a direct reference to the followers of Paul of Samosata, bishop of the Church of Antioch, around 260, the first theologian known to have used the word homoousios in Christian doctrine, and says, Canon 19, concerning the Paulinists who have come over to the Catholic Church, the decision is that they must by all means be baptized again. This itself is an outcome of the baptismal controversy that tore the church apart in the middle of the previous century, as exemplified in the writings of Cyprian of Carthage, leading to questions about the boundaries of the church, only within which it was claimed that the Holy Spirit operated. How then could those judged to be outside claim the efficacy of baptism? Is all this taking us far from our urgent work as Asian theologians, or is all this underlying our own work? And if so, why and how? Can we just shrug our shoulders and move on? Or should we put our shoulders to the wheel of Nicaea and play our own part in continuing to unpack those long ago events and disputes and offer our own perspectives and particular contributions to scholarship, not all of which is abstract, but basic to our Asian understanding of God, Christ, the Holy Spirit, and the Church? Another important reality that we need to analyze and free ourselves from dominant Western approaches to the history of the Church that focused on one trajectory post-Nicaea and labeled the dominant trend as being Christologically correct is the question of the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorian Church, headquartered in Iraq. An influential book dealing with the Christological conflicts, pre-Nicene, Nicene, and post-Nicene, lists Nestorianism as among the heresies. And the book itself, by David Wilhite, The Gospel According to Heretics, the book itself is an attempt to discover orthodoxy. Students of mine in the United States who think that Nestorianism is some kind of ancient heresy that has vanished are intrigued when I tell them that I have visited the headquarters of the alleged Nestorian church in India, in Thrissur, Kerala, and that the metropolitan of the Chaldean Syrian Church of the East, Mar Aprim, not only studied at our theological college, United Theological College in Bengaluru, but was the president of the Church History Association of India for many years. We have to recognize that the post-Nicene developments did not live up to the Emperor Constantine's expectations that theological and ecclesial divisions would cease once the Nicene formula was more or less agreed upon in 325. I quote, Constantine's efforts to consolidate orthodoxy had resulted in the shocked recognition that the notionally united Catholica in fact encompassed many local variations in practice, many local variations in discipline, belief, and doctrines. Creeds as consensus documents served as occasions for further fracturing. This is Paula Friedrichsen writing about the early church. Creeds as consensus documents served as occasions for further fracturing. Coercive measures at imperial initiative soon followed. Given that Christological arguments, issues, and themes became even more polemical following what was supposed to be a consensus at the Council of Nicaea, and that the events and councils leading up to the Council of Chalcedon in 451 were leading to even more fractures within the churches, and recognizing that Chalcedon itself did not resolve all the issues, including the issue regarding the nature or natures of Christ and the work of Christ, the persistence of churches and traditions that owe allegiance and theological gratitude to people like Nestorius is something that the Asian churches have to seriously and systematically reckon with, especially in the way in which church history or the history of the church in Asia is taught. Recognizing that, far from ending theological debate, Nicaea actually opened whole new battlefronts. Asian churches are called to examine how the empire played such a major role in doctrine and church administration, and recognize how this impacted not only the intricacies of past debates and the parsing of the person and work of Christ, but also more recent developments in the quest and search for historical understanding. At the same time, recognizing the power of the empire to exoticize the other, as for example, the reality that India gained a place in Roman minds as the ultimate exotic, a sense consciously expressed in artifacts and historical texts, but also even more telling, perhaps, in passing references to a wide variety of texts. How can the so-called exotic strike back at the empire, where the other becomes the interlocutor? Second, Nicaea and linguistic domains. The remarkable African-American scholar Robert Hood posed a very poignant question in one of his books, namely, must God remain Greek? And we need to ask, it's from a book entitled Begrimed and Must God Remain Greek? Afro-Cultures and God Talk. And we need to ask as to what extent the Nicene Creed must remain Greek, even as we consider the implications of language, linguistics, and translation in the shaping of the Christian imagination and or conceptualization of God in Jesus Christ, God and Jesus Christ. To what extent is it incumbent upon us to understand the phraseology of the creed in the context, which involves and includes the metaphysical and philosophical terminology used to come up with this compromise formula, and to reckon with the way the creed has traveled across time and space and embodied itself in our theological, liturgical, and devotional language, not to say anything about hymnody. Are we still banging our heads together on these and related theological issues, just as the Emperor Constantine, seeking to bring uniformity to the empire, considered the Arian controversy a nuisance to be removed ahead of the council, and, as one writer colorfully put it, he tried to overcome this by writing to Alexander of Alexandria and Arius and banging their heads together. This is how the German academic Wolfgang Kinsisch colorfully put it, banging their heads together. Now, banging heads together can only result in headaches or worse. So how best can we use the linguistic tools that we Asian theologians possess, not only in Greek, Latin, and Syriac, but in the multitude of languages that are either our mother tongues or languages that we have mastered? Can we Asian Christians, who, as the Indian theologian Stanley Samartha reminds us, are heirs to a double heritage, that of the Bible and that of other scriptures, really function as a bridge through which the insights of different scriptures might be shared in the larger community. Let me give you one example, and that is the phrase homo ousion tu patri, which in my mother tongue, Kannada, is translated Tandeya Tattvavu Itana Tattvavu Vonde. What is the linguistic domain of tattva? Because tattva is the word used for the so-called substance. Homo ousion tu patri, Tandeya Tattvavu Itana Tattvavu Vonde. The German philologist missionary from the Basel mission, Ferdinand Kittel, in his monumental Kannada-English dictionary, looks at this word, tattva, substance, and says that it connotates the state of being that, true state, real state, reality, truth, essential nature, the very essence, the real nature of the human soul, as being one and the same with the universal soul. This obviously draws on ancient Hindu philosophy, and Kittel also notes this when he points to its provenance in the literary and religious traditions of India. The well-known Upanishadic formula Tat Tvam Asi, translated as that thou art, now raises the question of whether the knowledge of Sanskrit in my own context is needed to unpack the meaning of the Nicene Creed, and begs the question as to whether we can engage in God talk only if we know Sanskrit. Obviously, opinions are sharply divided about the need for mastering the languages of those who were responsible for one's marginalization, or using such skills in smashing the power of the oppressors. Thirdly, Nicaea and marginalized realities today. While all this may seem esoteric and far-fetched from the messy realities of marginalized and suffering people in our own context, does Nicaea have anything to do with communities like the one I am most familiar with, the Dalit communities in India, including those who taught me what theology was all about when I served as a pastor straight out of Theological Seminary with 5 congregations of the Gauribidanur pastorate of the Karnataka Central Diocese of the Church of South India from mid-1984 to mid-1986. Drawing on what I experienced in an essay on the methodology of Dalit theology, one of the things that I stressed was that the traditional understandings of religion, the traditional understandings of religious practices, the why of conversion, religious objects, the instrumentality of worship and the liturgy, the importance given to the mediation of priests and those believed to have access to the numinous, all these have to be investigated using methodological tools that recognize that so-called academic, respectable modes of inquiry not only have serious inbuilt shortcomings and overt and covert prejudices, but that such modes of inquiry are deliberately skewered against the knowledge praxis of the modes of inquiry of those marginalized communities whose very marginalization was actively promoted by this so-called scholarship. As theologians and public faith practitioners in the context of religious pluralism, most notably explored in the Asian context by Stanley Samartha, and economic disparities, most notably and primarily explored by Aloysius Pieris, all impacted massively by new ways of interconnectedness and interdependence, where a small handheld device can contain worlds within worlds, where everything I say can be checked or questioned, responded to or disparaged in real time. I'm wondering what a revised Asian theology of liberation would look like without undermining the importance of the work of Aloysius Pieris in Sri Lanka, who reminded us that contemplation and action can be vitiated by self-seeking, by a veiled refusal to drink of the chalice of Christ or to undergo the baptism of the cross. Nicaea and the future of the church. It is fascinating that even as we talk about Nicaea and its legacy, we are also bound by the reality that we as a people claim to be those who are gathered into believing communities as a consequence of the person and work of Christ, and assert that our foundational documents are found in the Bible. It's in the same century that saw the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, the 4th century, that the books of the New Testament gradually came to gain ascendancy in various communities through complex processes resulting in what is called the canonization of Scripture. This has implications for Asian Christian theology and also for the ongoing process of biblical studies and interpretation, a task in which Asian scholars have excelled. We would do well to take the admonition of R.S. Sugirtharaja seriously when he writes that the often complacent claims of Asians and others that their interpretations are an alternative discourse may send a wrong signal. Such an assertion takes for granted a persisting and undisturbed preeminence of Western interpretation without making a serious and significant dent in it. It makes more sense to speak of a coterminous rather than merely an alternative or derivative discourse with the same scope and range of meanings as the dominant Western scholarship. When it comes to the Bible, we continue to wrestle with what Sione Havea and Monica Jyotsna Melanchthon call Bible blind spots. They invite us to reassess how and what we read in the Bible, as well as how and why we see the Bible as authoritative. The range of creative interpretative writings, including from Asia, brought together by these scholars and also by R.S. Sugirtharaja and Kwok Pui Lan, are impressive and eye-opening. In one such collection that brings together third world and indigenous scholars and theologians, Kwok Pui Lan writes about how the collection testifies to the strength of their Christian faith and the resilience of the human spirit. Their words and actions offer us a rare gift, hope abundant, which is also the title of the book. Nicaea and life together as churches in Asia. In talking about the imperatives today for Asian Christians, R.S. Sugirtharaja pointedly states that the crucial hermeneutical question is not what the historical Jesus looked like, but what he means in Asia today. As we pay attention to the echoes of Nicaea, the theological and ecclesial priorities for us today include allowing the convictions of that time to continue to permeate our life together, even as we pursue the ecumenical dream of embracing unity. So, what are these priorities? Recognizing how Nicaea named Mary in the Creed and linked her with the Holy Spirit in terms of the incarnation of Jesus, and asking ourselves as to how we have dealt with tokenization, mansplaining, leadership realities, not least in liturgical and ecclesial functions, the consequences of the feminization of poverty, family displacement, forcible separation, the impact of migration on women and girls, the use of mass media and social media to objectify women. given that women are invisible in the council itself, in terms of participants and in the historical reports, how best can this fleeting mention of Mary serve today as a challenge and opportunity to those of us gathered here, representing a variety and range of churches, traditions, and denominations, to magnify and affirm the parity of human beings in every aspect of our existence as religious beings. What does this mean in terms of recognizing Jesus, born of Mary, as the crucified people, in C.S. Song's phrase, Jesus, born of Mary, as the crucified people in ancient testimonies and affirmations and lamentations? Faced as we are with the challenge of what Kuan Sing Chen points out in talking about the formulation of Asia as method, also involving an attempt to move forward on the tripartite problematic of decolonization, de-imperialization, and de-Cold War. Recognizing how Nicaea named Pontius Pilate in the Creed and linked him to Jesus' crucifixion, and asking ourselves as to how we deal with the persistence of evil in our political, economic, social, cultural, interpretative, and ecclesial structures and systems. To what extent have we been conforming to the world and not seeking to actively transform it? What would transformation look like when it comes to realities like status, position, prestige, pomp, power, and the attribution of value? How do we understand the words in the Creed about suffering and being buried and rising and coming again? Have we been faithful to how all these are interconnected? Who is the one whom we await, if not the suffering and dying one? The one who sits at the right hand of the Father, the one who will come again in glory, glory that bears within it the horror of the cross and the evil intentions of those who would seek to crush the one who came down from heaven for us and for our salvation. Recognizing how Nicaea affirms God's creation as including things visible and invisible, asking ourselves about our place in the immensity of the macro and the invisibility of the micro. If anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to confront the unexpected but always present reality of death, which is characterized as the most absolute of absolutes, which is in fact a relative balance between the forces of decay and rejuvenation. This is from Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Song of the Cell, an exploration of medicine and the new human. A relative balance between the forces of decay and rejuvenation. How do we practice a theology of humility, given that the God of all creation is also the one who for us and for our salvation came down from heavens? Have we affirmed an anthropology of human-centric triumphalism? And if so, what does it take to recognize the challenge of the Creed to put us in place, so to speak, within the world of nature and all that God has made? Recognizing that Nicaea affirms God's reign as not having a telos, not having an end, what then are we commemorating now? Not 1,700 years as having an end in the churches, traditions, denominations that we embody and represent, but a dynamic end. A dynamic end calling us to revisit, re-energize, and revitalize the Nicene Creed. A creed that offers us a vision of enduring and dynamic faith and of unity that can be embraced. Together we can use our histories, or theologies, or liturgies, or ecclesial structures, or human ingenuity, as well as the faith commitments of the religious and of the religions and religious quests of our neighbors, whether they be antagonistic or affirming of our own faith journeys. All as fragments gathered up and offered as our ecumenical response to the perfect completeness of God who draws us into the life of the world to come. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kiran, for your eloquent and brilliant analysis of the Creed, Nicene Creed, as we commemorate the 1700th anniversary of the Creed. So your lecture will now live eternally on the cyberspace because it's streamed on YouTube. We do have some time for questions. So I will open it up and you can field the question yourself. Those of you who have any questions, please come forward and use the mic.
Thank you very much, Kiran, for splendid lecture. Obviously, Nicaea used Greek categories to talk about who Jesus was. And later on, you have considered 451 in use the terms of person, hypothesis, and ousia. All these are Greek terms and Greek categories. My question to you is whether these Greek terms and terminologies would make any sense to us Asian, number one. Number two, whether in Asian philosophy or Chinese or Hindu philosophy, is there other alternative terminologies and framework to express the truth of Nicaea? I just give an example. When instead of talking about natures, two natures, divine, human, we can talk about the yin and the yang within Christ himself, without division, without separation, without confusion, and without change. So there are two questions. Whether we can continue to repeat the Greek terminologies in the Asian context, or we can use alternative terminologies and philosophical framework, metaphysical framework to express the same truth.
Thank you very much for the lecture and for the question. And when you ask, are there alternatives and how Asians may be able to understand or misunderstand homoousia? It was not until grad school that my teacher told us homoousia came from the word ousia. And then this is a particular linguistic structure.
Sure.
The Chinese does not have the verb to be. And that is why you cannot form is. You cannot form being, be, and being. That is why it is very difficult to translate homoousia. So we try different ways.
True.
And that is why I was fascinated. How did the Chinese understand or not understand Christology then? And you talk about Nestorian. And then many of you know that in the 7th century,
They came to China.
there was this Nestorian tablet. The tablets talk about Trinity, but did not talk about Christology. And then the earliest Protestant missionaries in China talking about what are the alternatives. They could not understand what are these two natures. They talk about Jesus as medicine. Isn't this interesting?
Yeah.
That is, you suffer from some time
And you're
of
healed.
illness, and then Chinese medicine said, okay, then you need something. Okay, and then so I think it is very interesting. How should we look back to Nicaea, right? Is that something we think this is okay historically, prompted by the Greek philosophy? Today, we might, just like tourists, visited it. It's very interesting, very exciting. But now we ask other questions. I, as an Anglican, recited the Nicene Creed still. The Lutherans do. So what are we saying when we recite
The creed. So thank you very much, both of you. This is indeed a fascinating continuum to the lecture. And a couple of things. One of the easy methods followed in some of our contexts was to too easily look for an equivalent. Simple example, within the Indian religious heritage, Trinity, okay, Sat Chit Ananda. So there's something already existing in the Hindu traditional scriptures. That is the Trinity. So just take it and use it. Now, where did Sat Chit Ananda concept appear from? From a particular, very dominant, very class-oriented, very subordination-making group of elite, the elite section in India. And theologian after theologian in the 19th and 20th century did take up Satchidananda, wrote hymns about it, without exploring whether, in trying to find an analogy for the Trinity, they replaced one way of thinking with another, which may or may not have been identifiable and adaptable. To go back to the question of the so-called translation of Nicaea in the local context, for me the most interesting thing that I never thought I would want to do but have done is teaching confirmation class. So last month in the local church where I preach once a week, I was asked to do the entire history of the church in one 1-hour session. So I carried Diamond McCullough's Christianity, the first 3,000 years, which I use as a textbook, and I told these 6 rather indifferent American kids of Indian heritage who were totally indifferent. I'm going to summarize this 2,000-page book in... Actually, the pastor then said, why don't you do this session pre-Reformation? And I think he wanted to get out of the next confirmation class. So he asked me to do post-Reformation the next Sunday, which I actually did. But the point I'm trying to make is, it was when I taught confirmation class in my first parish with the so-called Dalit untouchable communities of India, several of whom were illiterate, that I realized the limitations of even my own mother tongue. And how did I realize this? Because when the missionaries came and the Bible was translated into Kannada, when the hymns were written and the prayer book was formulated, they needed local interlocutors. They needed the native agents. They needed the translators. And which community did the local people come from? The so-called learned communities, the so-called Sanskrit, Brahminical communities. So I'm standing in front of this congregation with the prayer book and trying to read and realizing that even in Kannada, my mother tongue, the terminology used did not relate to my people. Another example, what's the word we use for sacrament? Oh, it's prasada. Now, prasada in the Indian context is you offer something to God and God offers something back to you, a material object. So you go to Tirupati, you have a darshan of God, and you pay for, and you get a very sweet laddu, which is God's presents offered to you, which you then carry safely back and eat reverentially. Now, what has prasada got to do with the body and blood of Christ? So the inadequacy of terminology, which leads to the whole question, how do we communicate? What do we communicate? It's very easy to dumb down things. But what I found in these communities is never underestimate the interest of people once they trust you to explore all kinds of things. So the Greek terms and categories, does it make sense? Are there alternative terms? In one sense, alternative terms are still being discovered. But what we need and what is lacking in some of our churches is the patience, is the ability to take time to let questions seep and marinate and come back to you. We have this very strong principle of teaching from up down rather than allowing things to come forward. And sometimes in our own context, and I'm speaking from India now, the first translation, the missionary translation, with all good intention, becomes concretified. Attempts to have more contemporary translations, new ways of translating are questioned. I've said this story before and I'll repeat it again. When I was in my second parish in an urban context, people came to the vestry and said, there's a group of people who have come to sell the Bible. Bible, everyone should go, yeah, I want to sell the Bible, why not? So I asked, are they from the Bible Society of India? Which is the place where the Bibles are translated, published, and so on. I said, no, some other organization. Then I got suspicious. But if somebody wants to sell the Bible, why not? So I went out to find out what and how what they were doing, and they said, we are selling the Kannada Bible. This is the authentic version because it's translated directly from the King James Version. So you don't need Greek and Hebrew. When you have the King James Version, just translate it and sell it. So your questions are really important. We've inherited all this terminology in my own context. It's the Sanskritization of terminology. I've served in contexts where people are capable of understanding. Never dumb down so-called illiterate people and their quest for meaning. I won't forget at the confirmation when the bishop handed out Bibles that I brought, not the King James, I brought the Kannada Bible from Bangalore. The joy that the illiterate students, my congregation members, the joy of receiving the Bible as an artifact and that importance. So this is an ongoing struggle, an ongoing question. Your point about homoousios, and that's why I use the word tattva, which has this strong Sanskritic sense. And how do you communicate that in a particular... Do people have the patience, even highly educated people who are reciting the creed and rattling it off and knowing it by heart? How many people really have the patience? Just take a simple example, descended into hell or descended to the dead. Take another simple example, one holy Catholic and apostolic. Why do I keep running into printed versions in the United States context where Catholic has a capital C? Maybe there's a hidden desire to return to Rome at some stage. So I'm wondering about that. But thank you for those questions.
Thank you, Kieran, for that lecture. Your title of the talk is about the Council of Nicaea.
Right.
But you end up focusing on the Creed of Nicaea, which is the product.
That's true.
I'm more interested in the Council as a process. I'm curious how your paper could be different.
If you take
actually focus on the Council as a process.
Right.
And not on the product of the Council. Especially you began your talk by talking about how the church carried these things from the empire.
Right.
So why did you focus on the product and not the process?
since you asked it, it forces me to rethink, because I suddenly realized I have another chapter or an article that I wrote where I look at what happened immediately after the council. And that sort of responds to your point about the product and the process. So immediately after the council, Emperor Constantine organizes a really lavish banquet. And you have the decorations, you have the torches, you have the food. And Eusebius is wondering, just a couple of years ago, we were being hunted and tortured and persecuted. And now the same Roman soldiers who were antithetical to everything we stood for are guarding us. The emperor was so remote from us Christians. Now we are reclining at the table. And then you have the most extraordinary phrase which culminates in what the process of the Council of Nicaea led to, which is, this is what the kingdom of heaven looks like. So I think your point is well taken. What does the creed itself say? What does the process leading up to the creed teach us? What does the post-Nicene creed banquet celebration teach us about how easily the church became a department of the empire?
Anybody else? Question? Once again, thank you so much, Kiran, for the three questions were raised by the ATI faculty members who did not introduce themselves. One of them, the first question was Dr. Peter Fan, a Roman Catholic scholar, patristic scholar himself, written books on Holy Trinity. The second question was asked by Dr. Kwak Poilan, the well-known feminist theologian in the Asian community. And finally, final question was asked by Dr. Benny Liu, well-known Asian biblical scholar in North America and Asian hermeneutics. So this gives you a little bit of a flavor about what we do at the Asian Theological Institute. We pick up contemporary issues and wrestle with it, just as we examine the dissertation topics that our distinguished students from many universities are working on. So it's a pleasure to share this lecture with a wider audience besides the present audience. Thank you very much for being present, as well as those who are watching it sometime in the future in the cyberspace. Thank you. Thank you to United Theological College.